Today we're going to be working with 5-7, analyzing graphs of quadratic functions. So let's look at our directions. It says we're going to write quadratic functions in the vertex form. It says a quadratic function is easier to graph when it's in vertex form. You can write a quadratic function of the form y equals ax squared plus bx plus c in vertex form by completing the square. So you guys have actually already learned how to do this. I'm going to go over how to complete the square one more time, and then the last step is just going to be to graph it. Okay, so let's look at the example that they give us. It says we're going to write y equals x squared minus 12x plus 25 in vertex form. It says then we're going to graph the function. So you've been given a quadratic in standard form. Y equals 2x squared minus 12x plus 25 is standard form. So remember, we have to have our first term, our a term, has to be a positive 1. So here it's a positive 2. So what we're going to do, if you look at the next step, they factored out a positive 2. So what's left is x squared minus 6x, and then I have plus 25. So we are going to complete the square by using the formula, which was b divided by 2 squared. So I get 9, and that's where you're going to add 9 to both sides. Now, on my third step, if you look carefully, they actually had subtracted 18. And where they got the 18 from was the positive 2 and the positive 9. I really actually had 18 and not just the positive 9. And then we're going to rewrite the trinomial as a binomial, and then they added the 25 and the negative 18 together to get plus 7. So once you have the equation in vertex form, then you're going to graph the equation on the grid to the right. Okay, so let's work a few examples. Okay, I'm going to work a few examples. Let's look at problem number 1. It says I have y equals x squared minus 10x plus 32. So in this particular equation, my x squared, the a is already a positive 1. So again, I'm just going to remind you how to complete the square in order for us to turn it into vertex form. So let's look at number 1. Okay, our first step in problem number 1 is going to be to use our formula. Remember, our formula, in order to find what the new c term is going to be, is b divided by 2 and then squared. So my b term in this problem is negative 10. So negative 10 divided by 2 is a negative 5, and negative 5 squared is going to give me 25. So remember, that 25 is my new c term. So the next step is going to be to rewrite the equation. Now let me explain what this is. I rewrite my equation, and I have x squared minus 10x. My new c was a positive 25. And that's what I'm going to replace right here in the set of parentheses. Now, I still had a positive 32, okay, which is still part of the problem, but whatever I do to one side, I'm going to have to also do at the end of my equation. Here, we're trying to keep the equation balanced. So before, whatever we did to one side of the equation, we did to the other. In this particular example, because it is not an equation, whatever I add as my c term, I must do the opposite. So for this one, it's going to be subtract the same number at the end of my equation. Okay, so watch what happens. Then I'm going to take the trinomial, which is my three terms, my x squared minus 10x plus 25, and I'm going to rewrite it as a binomial, which we have already done. So my binomial, again, whatever variable I'm working with goes here. The way I get my sign comes from the b term. And then my number is going to be the square root of my c term, which the square root of 25 is 5. And then I'm going to combine like terms. So right here, I combine the positive 32 and the negative 25, and that's where I get plus 7. So I'm going to take this vertex form. This is your vertex form. And I can either plug it in the calculator to graph, or I will show you in class how we can actually graph it without using a calculator and using the vertex. Okay, so let's look at another example. Well, let's look at problem 2. Problem number 2 says I have x squared plus 6x. Now, what do you notice about this problem? You should notice that you don't have the c term. Okay, so my c term is just going to be 0. So if I use the equation b divided by 2 squared, I have 6 divided by 2, which is 3, and when I square it, I'm going to have 9. So when you go back and you put it in the original equation, look what happens. Now it becomes my c term, but remember, whatever I do over here, so if I add 9 to make my trinomial, I have to subtract 9 to keep my equation balanced. So from here, I'm just going to change my trinomial back into a binomial. So that's where I get my x plus 3 squared. And then that minus 9 doesn't have to combine with another number like it did in the first example. I'm just going to rewrite it. So again, you can graph this in the calculator, or I will show you in class how we can graph it using the vertex. So let's try one more example. Let's look at problem 5 on the same page. Okay, problem number 5 says y equals 3x squared minus 12x plus 5. This example is going to be a lot like the example that you have on your actual paper. So remember, my x squared has to be 1. So in order for that to happen, I need to factor out a 3 from my a and my b term. So step number 1, I factor out the 3. I'm going to end up with x squared minus 4x left and plus something. Pretend that box is empty. And then I have the plus 5 still left in my equation. Now what I'm going to do in order to fill in this box, which I have written in pink, is complete the square using the same formula. So I use b divided by 2 squared. So that's where I get the 4 from. The 4 is going to replace my c term. That's why I put it in the box. Now, can anybody tell me why on the right-hand side I have a minus 12 instead of a minus 4? What you should have said is the 3 on the outside of my equation, this 3 right here, I have to multiply it by the number that I put back in the equation. So I'm really adding 12 to this side of the equation, so I have to subtract 12 to this side of the equation. Again, the next step, rewrite my trinomial, which is in parentheses, as a binomial. So I have x minus 2 squared, and the 3 that was originally on the outside just stays put. And my 5 minus 12 is going to give me a minus 7. Okay, I know this one's a little bit different, but again, look at the example on the paper and use my example on the video. So flip the page, and let's look at another example. Okay, the next section that I'm looking at says write each quadratic function in vertex form. If not already in that form, then identify the vertex, axis of symmetry, and direction of opening. So I'm going to work a few examples in this section. I'm going to work problems 2, 4, and 8. So let's look at example number 2. Problem number 2 says I have y equals negative x squared plus 4. So guys, remember that my vertex is h comma k. In order for me to find my asymptote or my axis of symmetry, it's the h value, and the direction it just wants to know, does my graph open up or down. So here's how we're going to work problem number 2. If you notice, when I look at my equation, I actually don't have an h term. So here's how I work problem 2. I have y equals, I'm going to factor out my negative. I have x. Since there is no h term, I'm just going to leave it as a 0. And then I have my plus 4. So remember the format of how you're going to write vertex form. Remember, it's y equals a parenthesis x plus h squared. Or excuse me, that should be a minus sign. Plus k. So again, we're using this formula in order to rewrite my equation. So then it asked me for okay, it's my axis of symmetry. So remember, my axis of symmetry is my x value of my vertex. So if my x value of my vertex is 0, that's going to be my axis of symmetry. And in order to determine what direction it's going to open, look at the sign at the front. So if it's negative, it's going to open down. Okay, so let's look at another example. Let's look at number 4. Okay, the next problem is problem number 5. Now if you look, or excuse me, problem number 4. I have y equals negative 3 and in parentheses x plus 5 squared. This problem is actually already in vertex form. So if I label it out, there's my h. And what do I notice about my k? There isn't one. So when I ask you for the vertex, my vertex is actually negative 5, 0. Now, can somebody tell me why I have a negative 5 and not a positive 5? What did I have to do with my h term? That's right, I had to change the sign. So write that down if you forgot. I have to change the sign. So there's my vertex for problem number 4. For my axis of symmetry is x equals negative 5. And since I have a negative outside of my parentheses, I know that this graph is going to open down. Okay, so let's look at one more. Let's look at problem number 8. Okay, problem number 8 says I have y equals x squared plus 6x plus 2. So in this one, I'm actually going to work it really similar to problem number 2. I have to turn it into vertex form. So I'm actually going to factor my first two terms. So what I have in common on my first two terms, when I rewrite it, I have x squared. Remember, I have the b term divided by 2 squared. So 6 divided by 2 squared is going to give me 9. So I have x squared plus 6x plus 9 in parentheses, the plus 2. And again, whatever I do inside the trinomial, I'm going to have to do the opposite out here. So instead of a plus 9, I'm really going to have a minus 9. So the next step was to turn my trinomial into a binomial. So I have x plus 3 squared, and plus 2 and a minus 9, I'm going to end up with a minus 7. Okay, so here's my new equation in vertex form. And when I ask you for the vertex, it's going to be negative 3, negative 7. My axis of symmetry is x equals negative 3. And this graph is actually going to open up because there isn't a negative sign outside of the problem. Okay, now if you look at the next section, it says we're going to graph each function. You guys are going to do that part in class. So I'm going to do one more example. Look at problem 16 at the bottom of the page. So in the last section, it says we're going to write an equation for the parabola with the given vertex that passes through the given point. So here they give you the vertex, and it just wants you to use the equation y equals a parentheses x minus h squared plus k. So all we're doing is taking the first term and plugging it in for h, and taking our second term and plugging it in for k. So as I rewrite my first equation, I have y equals, there is no a, I'm going to have x. Now remember, what happens to my h term when I put it back in to my vertex form? That's right, I'm going to change signs. So I really have a minus 4 instead of a plus 4, and then I'm going to have squared minus 36. So all it asked me to do was to rewrite the equation. So I want you to do 17 and 18 using this example. I know this is a lot of material, so try and work some of the problems on your own, and I will be more than happy to go over with them tomorrow.